Hey everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to another episode of the mel0n Review. Today we're going to be wrapping up part 2 of my review of the VANCER Groove. Now I already covered some of the aspects of the Groove in my unboxing and first impressions video, but today's video is going to be a much more deep dive into the Groove, talking about how it performed, what's inside this mouse, and what VANCER did right and didn't do right with the Groove here. Now before we get into it, I did want to say a huge thank you to VANCER, who has kind of sent out the Groove for review, so thank you very much. That this review would have not been possible without them doing so. As always, regardless of a free discounted unit or an affiliation with a brand, reviews here on the channel will always be completely unbiased. Now if you enjoyed the review and you'd like to see more reviews like this, be sure to drop a sub here on the channel. I will have a teardown of the VANCER Groove coming out in a couple days, and I will also be covering the Thrash and the Trigger mousepad in the coming weeks, so if you want to see videos on those, be sure to get subscribed to the channel. Alright, now with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. First off, we're going to talk about how the Groove performed in game. Alright, now in terms of performance, overall the Groove actually really impressed me. This is a very well-rounded mouse in my opinion, with a really unique shape. Now the shape is very similar to that we saw on the Owl Cloud and the SteelSeries Sensei 10. However, the sides of the mouse have been shaved in a little bit just to make the mouse a little easier to grip. With the Owl Cloud and the Sensei 10, they were just a little bit too wide to be usable for some situations, and the Groove just being a little bit thinner does help its gripability significantly. It's definitely still well suited for larger hands like mine, but it is still usable for medium to large hands. Now, over my testing, I did find that the Groove felt best, quote unquote, in more dynamic aiming shooters. So games like Overwatch, Bad Business, Quake, Splitgate felt the best on this mouse. The mouse was still usable for static-oriented tasks like Valorant, Counter-Strike, and Rainbow Six Siege. However, because the shape, it just kind of leaned itself more towards more dynamic aiming situations. Now, I'll talk about why that is a little more later in this video, but I wanted to mention that off the top just because it is a very good performing mouse, but it is definitely well suited to more dynamic aiming tasks. Now, with the shape aside, I will say VANCER's wireless tech and 4K polling rate implementation has been very solid. This very unique dongle HUD is an amazing feature that I find myself really missing when I've used other mice, because the ability just to look at this little dongle to find out everything about your mouse is in terms of settings without having to open up software or do anything else is a really nice attention to detail, and I really wish more mice would do this because this is a really cool feature. Another really cool thing about this mouse is that the battery is extremely well optimized. This mouse has probably one of the best battery lives I've seen on a high performance mouse. It actually outlast a lot of similarly spec'd gaming mice in terms of battery life, which is very impressive. But overall, the Groove is a very impressive mouse. It is a very well-rounded mouse, but the shape does have some limitations, so let's talk about that next. Alright, now in terms of the Groove shape, so the Groove shell is a symmetrical shell. It is coming in at 125mm long, 64.5mm wide, and 38.2mm tall. Now, as I mentioned before, the Groove shell is very similar to the Owl Cloud and the Sensei 10. However, it has one big differentiating factor where the sides are outwardly tilted instead of inwardly tilted like we've seen on those other mice. Now, of course, due to the Groove being so similar to the Owl Cloud and the Sensei 10, it makes sense that this mouse is going to be very comfortable for people with bigger hands like myself. But because the sides of the mouse are outwardly tilted just enough, it makes it very easy to rest your hands against the bottom of the mouse and get a very good anchoring. This is kind of the opposite of what we found on mice like the Zowie U2, where the sides were just so inwardly tilted you couldn't get a good grip on it. This is the opposite, where it kind of gives you this ledge to rest your fingers on, which is a really nice attention to detail. The Groove's hump, also being that very long gradual hump design we've seen on the Cloud and the Sensei 10, does give the Groove a high degree of compatibility with lots of different hand sizes in terms of palm, thenar, and hyper thenar contact, but I'll talk about that a little later. Now, while the Groove does share a lot of similarities with the Cloud and the Sensei 10, a lot of these similarities are a good thing, and even though it is shaved in on the sides a little bit, so it's a little thinner compared to those mice, the Groove still does feel bulky in the hands. This means that the Groove is still going to have the same issues where the Owl Cloud had, where that mouse just feels very bulky in your hands. It can be kind of awkward to do micro corrections with. The same thing here is happening on the Groove, not as bad as it was in the Owl Cloud because the sides are shaved in by a pretty significant margin, and because of this bulkiness, I did find that the Groove did struggle a little bit with micro corrections and micro flicking. This is mainly why I said the Groove was better for more dynamic aiming games than static games, just because micro flicking and micro corrections in more static oriented games was kind of difficult just because the shape of the mouse is so big and so bulky. Now, this bulkiness does also have some other impacts in terms of how you aim your mouse. So if you're an arm aimer, you probably won't notice the bulkiness of the Groove too much. However, if you are a wrist aimer like myself, this becomes very apparent because, again, this bulkiness really does work against you in terms of micro corrections and that kind of stuff. Now, of course, this will vary depending on your aim style, and as I mentioned before, this isn't nearly as impactful as it was on the SteelSeries Sensei 10 and the Owl Cloud, but it is still definitely here. Now, as you get accustomed to the Groove, this will go away and your micro corrections will get more consistent over time, but it is still something that's kind of always there on the mouse, which is a little unfortunate. Again, this will vary depending on your aim style and depending if you're an arm aimer or a wrist aimer or a hybrid of the two. There will be differences here. Now, by all means, this isn't to say that the shape of the groove is bad by any means. I actually love the shape of the groove. Again, I like that the sides are shaved in a little bit to make it more comfortable, and it is incredibly comfortable for my 7.5 by 5 inch hands. But again, this inconsistency with micro movements due to the bulkiness of the mouse can impact the static performance of the mouse to a degree, which is why I definitely say this mouse is better suited for more dynamic aiming tasks. But overall, I do like the shape of the groove. I do think it is really good. It is significantly better than the shapes on the VANCER Cloud and of course the SteelSeries Sensei 10 because the sides are shaved in, which does cut down this micro correction issue significantly and makes the mouse feel less bulky, but the mouse is still bulky compared to most of the other mice on the market, and that will have some impacts on your performance depending on how you hold your mouse. All right, now in terms of compatible grips and contact areas, as I mentioned before, the Groove is very similar to the VANCER Cloud and the Sensei 10, and this mouse is definitely better suited for bigger hands. In terms of contact areas for my 7.5 by 5 inch hands using a claw grip, I found that the grip area was pretty balanced between the mid to low hyperthenar, the mid thenar, and the mid to high middle palm. As I mentioned before, because the Groove's hump is this long gradual hump, it does have a lot of play for different contact areas with different hand sizes. Now in terms of grip compatibility, this is where the Groove definitely does suffer a little bit just because this mouse is so big and is so optimized for bigger hands. So for small hands, this is going to be an only palm grip mouse, but even that, you have to have like small to medium size hands to even get away with palm gripping this mouse just because it is very big. For medium hands, you can get away with a palm and claw pretty safely, and for large hands, you can do palm, claw, or fingertip if you wanted to. Now, of course, since I have larger hands, of course, this mouse is going to be comfortable because this is probably one of the only sized mouse on the market that actually naturally fits my hand. So while I can fully utilize the shape, people with smaller hands won't be able to do so as much, and they will have a much more higher reliance on the coating. So let's talk about that next. All right, now in terms of the coating, this is one area I do have to give a lot of props to here because VANCER paid very close attention to the coating, and the coating is very well executed. I will say the coating feels very similar to that on the Death Adder V3's matte coating, with a little more textural feedback, but a little bit less grippy, if that makes sense, but by a very small margin. It does perform very well with both wet and dry hands. It does retain fingertips and oils from your hands to a degree similar to the Death Adder V3's coating and the OP1AK's coating, but not nearly as bad. If you notice your mouse kind of looking a little grimy, you can just wipe it off with a microfiber cloth and deal with this issue completely. Overall, during my testing, though, the coating performed exceptionally well. There was never really a point where I felt like I needed more grip. The coating alone was very solid, but I did test out the grip tape, of course, just to be fully thorough with this review, and the grip tape is actually surprisingly good as well. Now, these grips are a little bit on the thinner side, but they are a dual layered grip, so there's actually a fair amount of texture on these grips, which is very interesting. The Groove does come with 2 click covers and 2 side covers. Now, one really cool thing about this grip tape is that this is actually a bit of an Easter egg to VANCER's previous mouse. Now, as you can see, the texturing on this grip tape is this kind of playing card suit, if that makes sense, like there's heart, diamonds, clubs, and all that kind of stuff. This is a nod to VANCER's first mouse, the Gretze, which was a non-solid plastic mouse, and the actual holes in the mouse were these playing card suits. So it's the same thing here on this mouse, of course, but it's a solid shell. So VANCER decided to put the same texturing, I guess you could say, that there was on the original Gretze onto the grip tape here, which is a nice, cool little Easter egg. But overall, the grip tape here included with the Groove is surprisingly solid. Again, I like this little Easter egg and this little nod to the Gretze, which is really cool to see. Overall, very well implemented. Of course, it's not going to be as good as aftermarkets, but for stock grips, they're very solid. Easily probably the second to, arguably tied with the VANCER Cloud for the best grips I've seen included with a mouse in a very long time. All right, now in terms of build quality and QC here on the Groove, this mouse is actually very solidly built. Now, the side buttons did feel a little sticky, for lack of a better word, when I first started to use them, but over time they loosened up and they got a lot better. This seems to be isolated to my unit. I haven't seen anyone else report any other issues like this, so I think this was just my unit, but regardless of that, the side buttons are still completely fine. Now, I did want to note here, interestingly enough, the Groove has 4 base screws, where a lot of units only have 2. Now, this is cool for a variety of reasons. Number one, it does make the mouse significantly more durable, but it does also help keep the shells tight and prevent creaking and flexing on the unit. So this is a very nice attention to detail. I actually really do like this extra anchoring screw on the bottom because it makes the mouse feel very solid. Overall, the unit is built very solidly, built like a tank, and the QC is solid as well. So props to VANCER, they did a really good job in terms of the build quality and the QC here on the Groove. Alrighty, now in terms of weight and balancing, as I mentioned in my unboxing video, on the box of the Groove and all the advertisements and the product pages, the Groove is advertised as coming in around 47 ±2 grams, where in actuality, my Groove weighed in more around the 51.22 grams with the stock skates on. Now, this is something I would like to see VANCER rectify because it's pretty common for us to see some mice be a little on the higher side, but they're still well within the ±2 gram weight ratio, and this is well outside of that. So I would like to see VANCER clean up their marketing here and actually advertise the weight properly. Now, of course, the true weight of the product coming in at 51.22 grams is still completely fine in my opinion. It is well within that 45 to 55 golden ratio in my opinion of weights. I have no problems problems with the weight. My only issue with it is that it's not being properly advertised. Now, we have seen this happen a lot lately, specifically with the Ninjutsu Sora V2 and the Sprime PM1 and a couple other mice, and this is just kind of a thing that's been happening all over the place. So I would really like VANCER to take the time to maybe update their marketing and update their product pages so it more accurately represents the true weight of the groove. In terms of balancing, the groove is pretty much perfectly balanced, which is very impressive given the longer design of the groove. So very impressive there. No issues with the mouse being a little top heavy or bottom heavy. It's very balanced in terms of left and right side as well. It is just a very, very well balanced unit. So props to VANCER. They've done a really, really good job of the weight balancing here on the groove. Alrighty, next up, let's talk about the main clicks here. Now, the groove's shell clicks are these very unique, almost wing-like looking shell clicks. The surface of the clicks is convex. There is no indentation for your fingers here. It is using the same coating as the rest of the shell, which is a very good thing. I'll give you a little sound test here. Now, inside the groove is using Wano blue shell pink dot switches for the main button switch. Now, the clicks do have about a medium actuation force. They have a slight bit of pre-travel, but they have a lot of post-travel. They do have a good rebound, so despite the high degree of post-travel, the buttons are still fairly spammable. The clicks also feel consistent across the entire shell click, which is a great thing to see. Now, the thing about the groove here is that the clicks are just like borderline mushy. They do have a very mushy feeling to them. The really good rebound does help reduce this, but the clicks do feel just ever so slightly borderline mushy. Given the price point of the groove, you are competing with a lot of other very premium mice on the market, and if you compare the clicks of a lot of other similarly priced mice to the groove, they feel the worst out of the pack by a significant margin, which is very disappointing given the price point of this mouse. I expect these clicks to be a lot snappier and a lot crispier. I would definitely like to see VANCER adjust the clicks on future models to kind of pull them away from being that borderline mushy situation, maybe make them a little lighter in terms of their actuation force, slightly reduce the pre-travel, and just take away like half to 3/4 of this post-travel would make this mouse feel significantly better and much more akin to the other mice in the groove's price point. Alrighty, let's talk about these side buttons next. Now, the side clicks are these semi-rounded tilted side buttons. The side buttons are definitely rather small compared to the rest of the shell. Like if you look at the Wise Owl Cloud, the buttons are significantly larger. They definitely do feel a little polarizing given that they're so small compared to the rest of the shell, but it's not a huge issue. Now, they are positioned forward in the shell almost so much with my larger hands. If I'm putting my thumb towards the front of the mouse, I can actually cover a good part of the first side button click with like the bottom of my finger, and I can't actuate if I press into it, which isn't that big of a deal. I've never had any problems with like misactuating the button, but they definitely are a little more forward than other implementations I've seen. On the plus side though, the side buttons are using the same coating as the rest of the shell. I'll give you a little sound test here. Now, inside the groove is using Wano white dot switches, which is the common switch we've seen on pretty much every mouse on the market here for the side buttons. The side buttons do feel a little heavier than the main buttons in terms of actuation force, but they do have significantly better pre and post travel, where it has a very little bit of pre-travel and a very low amount of post-travel. Good rebound, but the actuation is definitely a little higher, so it's not as easy to spam the side button clicks as it is the main clicks. The side buttons don't feel mushy like the main buttons did, but they are a little hard to actuate just due to this higher actuation force. I definitely do think the side buttons could use some tuning, maybe making them a little lighter so they're easier to spam, and maybe slightly adjusting them so they're not as far forward in the shell will be welcome changes, but compared to the main clicks, it is a significantly better implementation here on the side buttons. No super concerning issues, just they're a little heavy and they are a little bit oddly positioned here on the groove. Alright, now the scroll wheel has a rubber texture across the entire surface of it. It does have this like sine wave light texture on it. It is very grippy and the wheel is flat, so it's very easy to actuate. The encoder is a TTC 11mm encoder, and it is using a pillar switch for the scroll wheel clicks, similar to the one that we saw on the Death Adder V3 and the Ponish Stormbreaker. Now, unfortunately, I don't know what pillar switch this is, as I wasn't able to find out from VANCER. I'm going to assume it's a Kale pillar switch because it looks pretty much one for one with the one we found on the Stormbreaker. Now, the scroll wheel is a pretty light scroll wheel in terms of implementation. It is very easy to scroll with very, very slight feedback points for scroll points. Overall, it's a pretty okay implementation. My only problem with it is that if you try and do the scroll wheel click on the groove, it's pretty easy to accidentally cause the scroll wheel to scroll, meaning that if you use the middle button for like muting and unmuting yourself on Discord and you're playing a game, you may accidentally like jump or switch weapons and that kind of stuff. It would be nice to see the scroll wheel tightened up a little bit, maybe make the actuation a little higher, or maybe change the encoder to something with a little bit of a more prominent scroll point to prevent this issue. But in my case, because I don't really use the scroll wheel for pretty much anything aside from pinging in game, this was completely fine for me. But if you are someone who does use the scroll wheel for like jumping in Apex or muting yourself and unmuting yourself in game, this scroll wheel may be a little complicated. Overall, the implementation is okay, but depending on your use case, you may have some issues with it. Alrighty, and as expected on any high performance mouse released in 2024, the Groove is using the standard combo of the Nordic 52840 MCU and the Pixar 3395. Now the 3395 is just a standard stock 3395 with the max DPI of 26,000. There have been no alterations to the sensor. It is just a stock sensor implementation, which again is completely fine. No issues with that. Now, according to VANCER, the Groove is also using a high-speed microchip. Now, I'm assuming this is what is controlling their God mode wireless tech, but I have yet to confirm that because I don't know if the God mode wireless is on or off the unit since there's no software right now. So I haven't been able to confirm that as of right now. I will talk about that more in the coverage of the web-based software once that eventually releases, so I can talk about that then. But as of right now, the microchip is there. Again, I don't really know if it's doing anything. I didn't feel the difference in terms of implementation from this mouse to other mice. Now, the high polling rate implementation on the Groove here is also very solid. Just like this hyperspeed microchip, unfortunately, there is no 8K polling rate because the firmware has not been released. I'm assuming that's going to be coming with the web-based software, but we're stuck waiting right now. So as of right now, I was only able to talk about the 2 and 4K polling rate, which is very well implemented. I had no problems with the performance. It felt on par with all the other 2 and 4K mice I've tried, but it's unfortunate I wasn't able to test the web-based software or the 8K yet. Again, I will cover that in a future video. It's just disappointing it's not here on launch. But overall, the sensor MCU and high polling rate implementation is very solid. Again, I will confirm a lot of the unknowns about this in a future video whenever the new firmware comes out and the web-based software is released. All right, now I did also want to talk about the battery life here. Now, this is a little confusing here because the battery life seems to be exceptional. However, right now there's no software for this mouse. I'm relying on the battery readouts on this little dongle here, and the battery readouts on this dongle are a little weird because I've used this mouse for like almost a week straight, and the battery life says it's only gone down by like 10 to 20%. And given that this is a 300 milliamp hour battery, that's not really lining up with the battery life I've seen on other units. Now, VANCER isn't really advertising any kind of battery life to be expected on this unit, nor are they advertising any kind of charging time. So this is a really weird one for me because the battery seems to last forever according to the little dongle here, but the dongle could be reporting 80% battery life when the mouse is actually at 20. And because there's no software, I don't have a way to verify this, unfortunately. So I'm not going to talk about the battery life in this video because I have no way of accurately testing the 1, 2, 4, and 8K polling rate battery lives and all that stuff, just because the battery rate here on the dongle is a little weird. I don't 100% trust it. Again, if it's actually the truth, this battery implementation is amazing. It's the best I've ever seen, but I don't think it's as good as it looks. So I apologize not having data here for the full review, but there's no real way for me to accurately test this stuff, unfortunately, but I will talk about this more in a future video. I will say though, the weird battery life aside, one positive here is that the Groove is using a standard size USB-C port that is compatible with pretty much any other cable, which is really, really nice to see. So no weird sized USB-C cables, which is a welcome sight. Alrighty, now I also want to talk about the stock skates here on the Groove. Now this is one area I'm going to be very blunt and very harsh with because these are the worst stock skates I've ever seen. Now the issue here with the stock skates is that because they're kind of soft, they have an insane amount of friction, so much so that the Groove felt insanely muddy. Now this combined with the bulkiness of the Groove's shape made micro corrections even harder just because these skates had such high static friction. I gave these stocks a fair chance. I tried them for about a week and a half to see if they'd wear in and maybe they'd speed up, but they just got worse and they just felt even slower over time, which was really surprising. I ended up removing mine and installing the ESP Tiger Yanzi dots and then the TGX plastic skates over those. And just to clarify, I'm not trying to like overemphasize or over dramatize this, but they were literally 10,000 times better than these stock skates. It felt so much better. So these stock skates are very bad, and I would highly recommend removing them. Don't even bother trying these. Just put on literally anything else. You'll be better off. Now, one problem with that is that unfortunately there are no skate removal ramps on the bottom of this mouse, which does make it very difficult to remove these stock skates. So that's kind of a double whammy here because you have bad stock skates and then you have no efficient way to remove the bad stock skates, which sucks. So if you're going to get a VANCER Groove or a VANCER Thrash, I would highly recommend getting a set of aftermarket skates to go with it. My personal recommendations would be the Extrapad Jade and Obsidian Donut skates or the ESP Tiger Yanzi dots. I would recommend using those. Just don't use the stock ones on the VANCER Groove or the VANCER Thrash. They are the worst stock skates I've ever tested. Alrighty, and lastly, let's talk about repairability. Now, as I mentioned before, the Groove does have 4 base grooves instead of standard 2, so you do need to remove both the top and bottom skates to gain access to the mouse, which isn't that big of a deal because you're probably going to end up removing them anyways, as I just mentioned before. But once you get inside the mouse, it is fairly serviceable. It's pretty easy to swap the battery and that kind of stuff. However, VANCER has made one critical error here where the connector on the main board for the ribbon cable for these side buttons is not a clip or connector of any kind. It's actually a force connector. And when I say force connector, you have to shove the ribbon cable into the slot here. Now, I really hate these connectors for a variety of reasons, but the biggest one is that because ribbon cables are so fragile and you have to force the cable into this little slot got here, it's very, very difficult, number one, and also it's pretty much guaranteed you're going to bend or kink the ribbon cable and potentially break it, which is really, really unfortunate to see. Now, weirdly enough, the connector on the side button PCB for the side buttons is a clip connector. So I don't know why VANCER did a clip connector on the side button PCB and then a force connector on the main board. They could have just swapped this and it would have been completely fine. Ideally, both of them should be clips. I generally don't understand why they did this, because this just makes repairability way harder on this mouse than it needs to be. And if you open up this mouse, I can almost guarantee you're going to damage your ribbon cable trying to get it back in, because it's a nightmare. Even for me, it's incredibly difficult to get them in. So this is another thing I would really like to see VANCER fix. Now, of course, with all mice I cover here on the channel, I will have a full teardown video of the Groove, and I will talk more about this connector in that video. So if you want to see how the Groove's built on the inside and how this connector works and all that kind of stuff, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss my teardown video of the Groove coming out in a couple days. Alrighty, well, in terms of final thoughts, overall, I think the Groove is a pretty solid mouse. However, this mouse is marred by a lot of really poor design decisions, which is a real shame, because this mouse, with a couple small changes, would be an exceptionally good mouse, but the current iteration does have a lot of problems. The main buttons and the side buttons definitely need some tweaking to make them a little snappier, a little more crispy. Every single stock skate VANCER has, they need to just go burn those in the pit and just get something else, because those stock skates are horrible. Again, I highly recommend swapping them out for something else. The non-clip design housing for the side button ribbon cable is disappointing to see and very frustrating from a repairability perspective. The lack of the web-based software and the lack of AK on launch is very disappointing. Again, they said it's going to be releasing at some point. We're still stuck waiting for it, so that is very disappointing to see. And again, we have no ETA when it's going to be coming out. Ironically enough, we're kind of stuck waiting like we are with the Prime PM1 and the Sora V2, where both of those companies said, yeah, AK is coming, guys, and it's been 3-4 months and we're still waiting. So it's very unfortunate not to see that. And again, that absolutely should have been here on launch. I really hate this recent trend of releasing mice with incomplete softwares or incomplete polling rate implementations. Even though AK isn't really that usable, it's still annoying having to wait for that, just because it should have been here on launch. And lastly, as I mentioned in my unboxing video, the stock cable that comes with the Groove is way too rigid for gaming use. If you're going to be using this as a LAN or in a high interference environment, the stock cable is unusable. You need to use an aftermarket cable, which is very disappointing. Having them switch to a less rigid cable would be a welcome sight for future versions. So those are the biggest issues with the Groove. Again, VANCER did a lot of things right with this mouse. I still think the shape is pretty good. Again, it's definitely well optimized for larger hands. The coding is exceptional. I love this kind of heads-up display dongle. This is a really, really awesome feature that I wish more mice would do, because when I switch to other mice, I find myself out of habit looking at the dongle and being disappointed there's not a screen there. So I love that feature. And then of course there's a situation with the battery life, where the battery life seems insane, but I have no way of accurately testing the battery life, which is disappointing. Again, this is just because the lack of software on launch makes this very difficult for me to test, which is really unfortunate. In my opinion, there's no excuse not to have the software at launch. There's no reason for this. I would rather them delay the launch of the mouse to have the software ready, rather than release the mouse without the software, because it's just frustrating trying to do small things for reviewing and testing, which is very unfortunate. I like the idea of the Groove. Again, VANCER's been out of the game for a very long time, just because they made some mice, they disappeared for a while, and then they came back with the Groove and the Thrash. I think they're on the right track. Again, I really actually do like the shape of the Groove. I do think it's a very good mouse overall. There's just a lot of executional errors with this mouse that make it very hard for me to recommend for the price point. At the price of the Groove, you are putting yourself up at the top echelon of competition, and a lot of the mice that are in similar price points to the Groove perform better. Arguably, some of them that are even cheaper also perform better, which is really unfortunate. And again, that's not to say the Groove is a bad mouse. I do like it, but there's just a lot of executional things on here that need to be addressed. I think if they make a couple tweaks to the things I just mentioned before, this mouse would be a light years better. Things may change in the future. We'll see if they make some optimizations to future batches, but as of right now, the Groove is a bit of a miss for me. I like the idea of the mouse. There's just too many executional problems on this mouse for me to recommend it. Hopefully VANCER will address some of these issues in a future batch, but we will have to wait and see what they do. If you'd like to learn more about the Groove, I will have the product page linked down in the video description for your reference. But that is going to be everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss any future reviews like this. Again, I will have a teardown video of the Groove coming soon, and I will have a review of the Thrash, and I will of course have a video on the AK polling performance, the web-based software, and more in-depth talk about the battery life and that kind of stuff whenever that software does release. So I'll have a video on that coming out soon. If you'd like to support the channel here and everything I'm doing here with the reviews and the teardown project, you can become a member here on YouTube. Members get their names shouted out at the end of videos, or you can support the channel by using code mel0n over at Raven Mouse Pads, TJ Exclusives, Mech Keys, and Lethal Gaming Gear to save some money on your orders and help support the channel that way. Thank you very much for watching my review of the VANCER Groove, and I will catch you all on the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.